Good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure to host this webinar today. I'm Ashish Shanker. I head the wealth management business at Motilal Oswal, and I'm happy to bring you another series of the Vantage webinars, which is basically a masterclass where we talk to experts from various fields to get you some meaningful insights. Today we've got an extra special guest, and to introduce her, I have with me Susmit Patodia, who's a fund manager at Motilal Oswal Asset Management Company, and he will be co-moderating this webinar with me. But before I hand it over to him, I just wanted to take maybe a minute to talk about the theme today. I think it is something that we grapple with on a day-to-day basis, which is making decisions. And all of us know how important decisions are, to how our life eventually turns out. And we struggle with it every day. To be honest, I have struggled with it for the longest. But today's expert has evolved, developed a very, very scientific framework for decision making. And it comes from a sport that I love to play. My co-moderator here, Susmit, also is a player. I'm really looking forward to today evening, and I'm sure all of us will gain from this interaction. So Sushmit, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you, Ashish. Good evening, everyone. Good morning to Annie. This is a little bit of a fanboy moment for me. So I have the honor to introduce Annie. Annie is famously known as the Duchess of Poker. She holds a gold bracelet that she won in 2004 WSOP. She's also famously won the National Heads Up Championship Poker in 2010. For a long period of time, she was the largest grosser in tournament winnings playing poker as a woman. Right now, she's an author, she's a corporate speaker, she's a consultant in the decision-making space. And as Ashish rightly said, that's the topic today. She's written 2 bestsellers. Her latest book on decision-making, how to decide, has just been released. There's a nice backstory to that as well. Maybe we can uncover that in the series of the conversation. Her previous book, Things in Bets, is a national bestseller, and most of us would have read that. Interestingly, Annie is also the co-founder of the Alliance for Decision Education, which is a very interesting not-for-profit organization. It actually improves lives of students by teaching them decision skill education. And when I read about this, I was quite surprised that decision making is such an important thing for all of us, and there's not a single course on decision making when we study. So very interesting, not-for-profit. With these words, we welcome Annie Dew, and thank you very much for sparing time on an early winter morning at your destination. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here, as early as it is, but I'm here with bells on, as we say.
And I just wanted to add, Annie, that I can see we've got record participation today. So you're very, very popular in India.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm excited to get into it.
So, Annie, this is your debut in India.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could tell us about your life journey a little bit to all of us, so that sets context, and we can take it from there.
Yeah, sure. So my life journey is going to sound kind of winding, but there's a thread that I pull all the way through it. So I started off my adult life thinking that I was going to become an academic. So I did my undergrad work at Columbia, and then I went on to do my PhD work at UPenn. And so I was at UPenn for 5 years. I was studying cognitive science, which cognitive science encompasses a lot of stuff. So it's all the way from, you'd find some interaction with like computer science departments and AI to developmental psychology, to behavioral science, we're getting into behavioral economics and biases, heuristics, perception. It's kind of everything. It's all about how our brains kind of build models of the world and interact with the world. But what I was specifically studying was how children learn their first languages. So I know that probably sounds a bit far afield from poker. If you want, we can get into why it's not, but it was a learning problem. And that's kind of the key. It's how do you learn in systems which, are noisy. I mean, it's language, but where it's not clear how you're supposed to map, in this particular case, sounds onto meanings. So I was doing that, and it's a really interesting topic because, every 18-month-old has it mastered. But if an adult tries to learn a new language, it's quite difficult for them. So it's kind of an interesting problem. But anyway, that's what I did for 5 years. And I was going to go off and get a tenure track position. And right at the end of my time in graduate school, I actually got sick. I had a sort of chronic stomach issue that became acute. And I needed to take a year off before becoming a professor, which is still what I intended to do. But I discovered that I needed some money in the meantime. So this was a time when poker was not on television. I just need to remind everybody of that. So this was kind of a strange thing that I did. So there was no way, like, for somebody who was growing up to watch poker on television and to think, oh, that's a really interesting thing that I might do for a living. The only, way that you would know anything about poker much was through movies, things like The Cincinnati Kid. And so it wasn't something that was kind of a well-known thing. But my brother was already a poker player. And so, when I needed money and also I didn't feel well, I didn't want to start a new career, I needed flexible hours, there was a whole bunch of constraints. My brother said, well, why don't you play poker? Which wasn't that weird because I'd watched him play some, I'd played a tiny bit myself, just like he'd given me a little bit of money to go off and play. So I knew a little bit about the game. And he started coaching me. And so, I was going to do that. In the meantime, that turned into 18 years because I played from 1994 to 2012. So I didn't actually at the time make it back to my tenure track position. But so I really dove deep into poker for about 8 years. And then in 2002, I got asked to speak to a group of options traders about how poker might inform thinking about risk. And I talked a little bit about risk, but it was much more about risk attitudes. How does the state of winning or losing actually affect you emotionally so that you actually make decisions that are distorted, that aren't particularly rational in regards to risk. So anyway, I talked to them about it, but that was this moment where I kind of realized there was this very interesting conversation to be had between cognitive science, my background, and poker that I was having already kind of implicitly in playing, but I hadn't thought about it in an explicit way. And I discovered there's this really interesting conversation there and kind of something happening in between the two spaces. And I just got really eager to explore that. And then through that first talk, I started giving a lot of talks, and then I started consulting. And then the balance of my life started being more in the business space and talking with, doing performance coaching and decision coaching and thinking about decision systems that might really improve process. And about 20% of my time by that point was spent on poker. And then in 2012, I retired. Founded the Alliance for Decision Education, wrote these 2 books, started consulting and doing the business work full time. And now the fun thing is I'm back at Penn. So now I'm in Phil Tetlock's lab working on super forecasting. So I did make it back to academics eventually. It just took me, let me think, how long is it now? Gosh, it took me 26 years to make it back to academics, but I did finally get there.
Right. Great. Thanks for that, Annie. So if we can start off at the very beginning, which is your simple framework between decision and results. If you can unpack that a little bit for us, and we can take it from there.
Sure. Yeah. So here's the problem that we all have as decision makers. And this is where you're going to be able to see whether it was poker or thinking about language acquisition or decisions in a business setting or a personal setting. There's uncertainty. And the uncertainty really stems from a couple of places. One is that there's very few decisions that we make with perfect information. So it's very rare that we'd be in a situation where we know so much about it that it would be like flipping a coin, where we know that it's going to land heads half the time and tails half the time. So we would have perfect information about that situation. That is almost never. And you can see how in a game like poker that is true, because I can't see my opponent's cards, and I don't know how my opponent is going to act toward their cards. So there's just a lot of stuff I don't know when I have to judge what my best move is. So that's one source of uncertainty. The other source of uncertainty that relates a lot to this problem of just outcomes and decision quality is just plain luck. That there's this random force that acts upon us, and you can see where that would be in poker, right? Because I can play a hand perfectly and get myself into a situation where the only way I could lose is if the queen of clubs hits, and I don't have any control over where the queen of clubs is going to hit. It's going to hit 2% of the time, about slightly less. And what that means is that 2 times out of 100, I'm going to observe the queen of clubs, and I don't have any control over which time those two are going to occur. In fact, they could occur 2 times in a row. I don't know. So what that means is that because there's this uncertainty in the system, that there is not a perfect correlation between the quality of the decision you make and the quality of the outcome that you get. And what ends up happening is that we do something called resulting, which is that we act like there is a perfect correlation between the two. In other words, if we have a bad outcome, we think that there was a bad decision associated with it. And if we have a good outcome, we think there's a good decision associated with it. Now, that's actually not a mistake if you take the uncertainty away. So you can look at a game like chess, where I can see my opponent's whole position, and there's really not the same type of hidden information. So there, and then the other thing is there's not luck. Those pieces move by an act of skill. There's a little bit of luck, but not a strong influence. So what that means is that if anybody's watched Queen's Gambit, you should. I'm not sure if that's in India, but you can watch her do this in her head, when they're showing what's happening in her head, that when she moves a piece, she knows what all the possible responses are, and then she can figure out what all her possible responses would be, and so on and so forth. So what that means is, like, if you and I play a game of chess and you beat me, we actually do know that you must have made better decisions than me. But that's not true in a game like poker. In poker, you could beat me, and it could just be because you're not better than I am. You actually made worse decisions than I did, but you hit a queen of clubs. And then you can get into simple decisions that are away from games, like going through a traffic intersection. And we know that the same thing holds there. Just because I get in an accident doesn't mean that I made a poor decision. It could be that I just got unlucky. I could have followed the rules of the road with a car in good repair, and someone could have just hit me. So why is this such a humongous problem? Well, we can think about when we get into these worlds where decision quality can be pretty opaque. Was it a good hire? Right? Is my investment thesis good? Should I be value investing or growth investing? We can certainly collect a lot of data on it so that we can close the information gap, but we can only close it so far. We are making these models of the world. They're going to only capture some of the phenomena that occur. And then there's just plain luck involved. So as you're looking back at an individual outcome, right? I hired one person and it didn't work out, or I tried to close a sale and it didn't happen, or whatever it might be. It's actually quite hard for us to figure out whether that was a good decision, but we pretend like it's not. So what ends up happening is, if you have a bad outcome, you assume it's a bad decision, and then you'll tend not to repeat it. And then if you have a good outcome, you'll assume it's a good decision, and you'll tend to want to repeat it and sort of amplify it at that particular decision strategy. And that's really bad, because it's not necessarily so that those are good or bad decisions.
In fact, Annie, you touched upon a very important subject, and we see this in our industry all the time, because when you make investment decisions, almost 90% of the time, we look at the past performance, which brings me, to the second important point that you alluded to in your book, which is the hindsight bias, right? So I'm just going to put up, the matrix that I saw in your book,
Yeah.
which I found really brilliant. So if you could, just take us through this 2x2 matrix, and
Yeah.
and you've also spoken about the hindsight vaccine. I mean, how do you mitigate, the impact?
Yeah. So, okay, so this is actually a great visualization of the possible relationships between decision quality and outcome quality. So you can make a good decision that gets a good outcome. That would be an earned reward. Obviously, investing, that's what we're trying to go for. In life, that's what we're trying to go for. You could make a good decision that results in a bad outcome. That would be bad luck. You can make a bad decision that results in a good outcome, which would be dumb luck. And then you could make a bad decision that results in a bad outcome, which would be just desert. So when we think about the resulting problem, what we can see is that when we're judging decisions, particularly of other people, we sort of forget about the luck and we focus on earned reward and just desserts. That's kind of how we act in terms of the way that things are related to each other. Now, there's another interesting phenomenon that when we're judging our own decision making. So I'm thinking about, why did I personally win a hand or lose a hand? When I invested in something, why did my investment win or lose? Now we'll actually do something slightly different. So we treat other people differently than we treat ourselves. And when we think about it for ourselves, we engage in something called identity protective cognition, which is trying to make sure that the answer that we get to is that we made a great decision. And you can see why that would be, because when we're thinking about ourselves, we all want to think well of ourselves. So we want to feel like we're good decision makers, and we want to feel like we're competent. And if you're going to get to a good decision, notice what happens is that when you have a good outcome for yourself, you say it's an earned reward. I'm such a good investor. I make such great decisions about what I'm supposed to invest in. That's why this thing won so much. But what happens when you have a bad outcome when an investment loses? You say, I got so unlucky. I can't believe that happened. A pandemic arrived. So you can imagine this kind of twofold, right? People who invested in Zoom before the pandemic, which may or may not have been a good investment, but it certainly wasn't the investment that it turned out to be. That's really a matter of luck, right? The pandemic is an intervention of luck that's like super helpful for a Zoom investment. But you can imagine that people who invest in Zoom are going around telling people how brilliant they are, that they did it. Now, I'm not saying it was a bad decision. Zoom may very well have been a good investment. It just wasn't as good as it was. And they're all talking about how great they are. But for people who invested in something that does not do well in the pandemic, say office space, they're now talking about how unlucky they are. And for both of them, luck has intervened. For both people, luck has intervened. But the people who have won to the luck are saying that they're really smart and it doesn't have anything to do with luck. And the people who have lost to the luck are saying it's only because of the luck that I have lost. So that is a particular pattern called self-serving bias. It's one that you really want to watch out for. So you can think about it as we do resulting when we're thinking about other people. We tend to engage in self-serving bias when we're thinking about ourselves. And then we can add to the ruckus with this problem of hindsight bias. And what is hindsight bias? Well, when we make decisions, we have a certain state of knowledge. So when we're talking about resulting or self-serving bias, we're thinking about the luck component. How good are we at seeing the luck, that particular form of uncertainty? But remember, there's this whole other form of uncertainty, which is information uncertainty, right? That we have incomplete information when we're making decisions. Okay, so when we make a decision, we only have partial information. Like we don't know a pandemic is coming, for example. But then after the fact, what happens is that we feel one of two things: that we should have known it was going to happen, or that we did know it was going to happen. So I'm sure that we've all seen this happen, but I had a really good, simple example of this happen in a grocery store once. I was listening I overheard a conversation like in the produce section, and a woman was talking on a cell phone and she had an accent, and a man said to her, "Oh, are you Italian?" And she said, "No, I'm Greek." And he said, "Oh, I knew it." It's like, well, no, you didn't know it, because you just 2 seconds ago said, are you Italian? So this comes up in investing all the time, this hindsight bias problem, that we invest and there's some probability that the instrument that we invest in is going to win or lose. A particular stock is going to win or lose. We only have partial information, obviously, when we make those investments. And then the investment does as it does. And a lot of times we'll learn new things. And we'll say like, I knew it was going to lose, or I knew it was going to win, or I should have known it was going to lose, or I should have known it was going to win. And obviously you can know no such thing because you, I assume, didn't have a time machine. So how do we actually deal with both of these problems? Well, the first thing in terms of dealing with resulting is, first of all, to make sure that you really explore these 4 quadrants. And when you're thinking about any result that you get, think about, well, what quadrant is it supposed to fit in? And that means that you have to both think what were matters of skill and what were matters of luck. And you can see that would help with the Zoom investment, right? I predicted that Zoom was underpriced because people were going to start working more at home. That part was a good decision, but I also didn't predict that the pandemic was going to happen. So I did not know that. That's something that revealed itself to me after the fact. So notice that deals with both resulting and the hindsight bias problem, because you remind yourself that the pandemic wasn't knowable beforehand, right? So you want to think, what are the other ways that it could have turned out? How likely are those things to have occurred? That allows you to see the luck properly. And then what you want to do is actually do what's called knowledge tracking, which is, what are the things that I knew beforehand? And what are the things that revealed themselves after the fact? And then when you look at the things that revealed themselves after the fact, you can say, could I have known about it beforehand at a cost that I could afford? Like sometimes you could know something, but it would take too much time and the opportunity would go away, as an example. But if the answer is no, then just ask, could I know it in the future? Should I include that for future decisions? If the answer is yes, then say, I'm going to include it for future decisions, and that's about it. But you want to try to separate those 2 things out and do that knowledge tracking. Now, just pro tip, it's better if you do all of this before you make the decision so you have a record of it, because it is harder to sort of reconstruct it in retrospect.
I love the way you framed the term memory creep for this phenomena, where, often we hear the term from other people that I told you so.
Yes, and that is exactly, that's memory creep. So how many times have you been in that situation where you worked through something with someone beforehand, and then new information reveals itself, and then they say to you, I told you so. And you say, you're in your head, you're like, no, you didn't. You never told me so. But this is what's called memory creep, but it happens to all of us. There's actually quite a famous example right in America from the 2016 election. So as everybody may recall, because I think it's pretty famous, Hillary Clinton lost that election because there was a polling error. And the polling error was specifically in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, three very important states that she lost. But the thing about a polling error is that by definition, you can't know about it until after the fact. That's kind of that's what a polling error is, right? Like there's a polling error and then you actually take the vote and you discover that the polls were wrong. So this is absolutely something that you can't know about until after the fact. But when you listen to the American punditry talk about this, you can really see this memory creep in 2 ways. One is they say she should have known about it, which is interesting because nobody else knew about it. Nobody was writing about it at the time. You can go and search, and there was, in fact, the main things that you can find are questioning Donald Trump campaigning in those same places. So I'm not sure how she could have known about it if this is something that you can't know until the vote gets taken, right? So that's problem number 1. But then problem number 2 is also this memory creep problem of, now when you listen to people write about it, they say they did know about it, even though there's literally no evidentiary record of this whatsoever. And you can imagine that when you take these 2 things together, this really creates something that I call the paradox of experience, which is it really makes it hard to learn from an outcome, at least when you don't aggregate them together. Because first of all, we take way too much from it in terms of what the quality of the decision is. But second of all, how can we possibly learn from experience if we don't even remember it accurately? And that's what's happening with this hindsight bias and memory creep. And that's why it's so important to take the time to do this kind of knowledge tracking so that we can actually understand what was my knowledge position at the time that I made the decision, and was it reasonable to make the decision I did when I knew what I did? Because it's always going to be the case in your life, because of uncertainty, that at some point in the future, you're going to learn something where you say, if I had known that then, I would have made a different decision. But that in itself doesn't make it a bad decision unless that thing was actually knowable and you knew that that information was available and you didn't bother to go find it.
Right. In fact, I'm sure Susmit must be hearing it all the time. People telling him that he should have bought this stock or sold that stock.
Yeah, in fact, when you say, it's very interesting about how do you know what you're supposed to know at the moment you make the decision, right? That itself is very variable. But very interestingly, you touched upon having a sort of a framework. And that's what brings us to the next part of your book, which talks about gut. And right, and gut is very important in India, right? Not only because we have got very oily food, but also a lot of entrepreneurs. but frankly, because a lot of entrepreneurs in India are transitioning their business from first generation to second generation, right? Or from owner managed to professionally managed. And that's where the importance of gut versus tool comes in. So if you can help us with your thoughts on this.
Sure. Well, let's start with the resulting in hindsight bias problem. Those are problems of your gut, right? So you get an outcome, and you can think about this like from a portfolio perspective, right? If you invest in a good diversified portfolio, the reason why you're doing that is because there is luck, because there is hidden information. So what you assume is that across that set, you should be positive expected value. You should be winning to each individual one. But again, on any individual one, the Queen of Clubs can hit. And what happens is that even though we kind of know that going in, because that's the whole point of having a basket of stocks, when one of those stocks loses and one wins, we say, why didn't I have all my money in the one that won and none of my money in the one that lost? Well, because you couldn't have known. And if that were true, I would only have bought the best stock, that was available. Like I would have held Apple for a while and Google for a while, and I'd be moving around like a ninja, right? But I can't do that. That's the whole point. But in retrospect, we act like that's what we should have done, which is so we go in with this intention. And that's a gut problem, is that your gut is telling you when that loss that you shouldn't have done it in the first place. Your gut is telling you that you should have known that it was going to happen, or that you did know things that was going to happen. So that's the first clue that gut maybe isn't the best decision tool. But we can step back from that a little bit and say, well, what makes a good decision process, and what are the tools that we would want to use? What are the quality of the tools that we would want to use in order to implement a good decision process? And here's the important thing about a tool. We can think about something like a screwdriver. Okay, so if I have a screwdriver, I can use it for the same purpose and get the same result reliably. So that's piece number one. Piece number two is for you, Susmit. I can show you, I can say, here's this screwdriver. I will teach you how to use it so that you can get a similar result to me. Now, obviously, I might be a more talented carpenter than you are, or you might be more talented than me, but you can still come up with something that's going to be much higher quality than if you didn't have the tool and you didn't know how to use it, right? So I can teach you how to use this thing to produce something similar to the thing that I would produce using that same tool. And then here's the other really important thing. You can watch me do it, or I could watch you use the tool, and then I could tell if you were using it wrong. So I can actually see, are you applying this in a quality way, right? Are you using that screwdriver to try to pound a nail into the wall? Stop doing that. That's not a good way to get a nail into the wall, right? So are you using too small a head for the screw that you're trying to get in? These kinds of things. So we can actually critique that. So let's think about that in terms of gut. I can't teach you to use my gut because it's mine. Also, ew. But anyway, so I can say to you, like, think about how unsatisfying that is. If I do have a business, and obviously what I would like is to improve the quality of the decision-making that everybody on my team is making. Well, if I believe that I have a good decision process and I make good decisions, I would like to transfer that knowledge to you. I'd like everybody to be able to use the screwdriver that's so great for the job. But if I just tell you, well, my gut told me so, then we have a problem, because I can't actually give you the ability to execute on that well at all. So I can't explain it to you. And then you can't actually critique it, nor can I. right? You can't look at it and say, well, actually, I think that you were biased here, or you made a mistake here, or you could have actually done this better, because it's kind of a black box. You can't examine it in that same way, right? So that's another huge problem with it. And then the other problem with gut is that it's not going to produce the same result reliably. So when we know this, and you'll see this, Daniel Kahneman has a new book coming out in the spring with Cass Sunstein and Olivier Siboney, called Noise, which is really about how variable our decision making is. That, when you look at judges, for example, that are faced with very similar cases, they'll give very different sentences depending on a variety of factors, none of which are particularly rational, or none of which they can really identify. And that's a problem of gut, right? Your gut is sort of leading you along, and it's not getting you to the same answer each time. Particularly when you're running a business, you'd like to get to the same answer about the same types of problems. So that's sort of the problem, is your gut is not a tool. But then there's another big problem, which relates back to this idea that, like, resulting in hindsight bias or gut problems. It's not just resulting in hindsight bias. It's basically any bias, cognitive bias that you can think about, whether it's this motivated reasoning problem or self-serving bias or confirmation bias, are all problems of the gut, because they're all inside view problems. Our tendency when we're making decisions is to make decisions from our own, within our own perspective. In other words, how do we think about the world? What are the mental models that we apply to the world? What are our own perspectives? What are our own facts? What are the ways that we think about those facts? And often that is quite wrong, because that is often really biased. For one thing, when we think about something like confirmation bias, which is that we tend to pay attention to information that agrees with us, we seek out information that agrees with us. Obviously, that's going to amplify the beliefs that we already have. And we're not going to run into people who have different perspectives, or who might correct things that we believe that aren't true. That's an inside view problem. And basically, you can think about the inside view as mainly very, in large part, kind of driven by your gut. But we know that we want to know what base rates are, right? I don't want to buy a stock because I have a feeling about it. I want to buy a stock because I've been done an appropriate analysis on something as simple as what's the price to book. I would like to know that fact, right? What's TAM? I want to know what this, I want to know how crowded the market is. I want to know what traction is, what the competitors are. What's the unit economics? Is the market underestimating how many widgets they're going to produce over the next 6 months? These are things that tell me whether I should be buying something, not I've got a good feeling about it. So we really actually want to move away from gut decision making. That's not to say that gut doesn't ever come into play, but you have to have a really good, repeatable, teachable, examinable process that's in there, that's disciplining the ways that your gut can go wrong.
So, Annie, that brings me to my next question. Unlike chess, poker and life are very similar, where, you have incomplete information, and the information changes as the, cards come out. So you have defined a very nice framework, which is called the 3 Ps, to think about decision making. So if you could just, give us some background about it.
Absolutely. So the 3 Ps are going to help you with both problems. They're going to help you with the issue of really being able to see luck properly, but it's also actually going to help you with the hidden information, because what the 3 Ps makes you do is make explicit what's already implicit in any decision that you make. And as soon as you do that, you're generally going to go hunting for knowledge to help you to make that explicit. So this is taking something from gut and turning it into an explicit process. So let me explain what the 3 Ps are. Every single decision that we make is a prediction of the future. Even super simple ones. If I'm in a restaurant and I'm trying to decide between 2 dishes, should I get the sag or the, tikka masala or the vindaloo? I don't know. Whatever I'm trying to decide between, whichever thing I choose, I'm predicting that I will enjoy that more than the things that I reject. Or maybe I'm trying to eat healthier and I'm predicting that I will that my health will be better if I eat this, and my health in the future will be better if I eat this dish than if I eat this one. When you decide what route to take to work, that's a prediction of the future. I think that if I leave on this route at this time, it will get me to work, in time that I will not be late. And then when you get into more complicated things like which candidate do you hire? Obviously you're making a prediction of the future about how good that job candidate is going to be in your company. When you decide what stocks to invest in, you're saying that's going to get you towards your goal the most. So whatever decision that you're making, it's just a prediction of the future. So you could do that by your gut, or let's make it explicit. It's going to be better if you make it explicit, and you do this through the 3 Ps. So the first thing that you want to do is think about, you want to identify what all the different possibilities are for the way that it can turn out. You can think about those either as kind of broad scenarios, like if I take this job, it could be, I could really love everybody there, and I could get a lot of, I could advance really quickly, or I could kind of like it, and also I'm going to have to move to a new city, and maybe I'm not going to like the new city. And you could kind of think about it in broad strokes, or you could focus on something that you really care about, right? So it could be, for example, if you're investing in a stock, you can think about what's the probability that it's going to be down, by 15% or more in the next year, that it's going to be between 0 and 15% in the next year, that it's going to be about even, that it's going to be up. And you can sort of create bins that you could be forecasting into. You could do that with, if you care about a particular feature of a candidate that you're hiring, like, I'm hiring somebody and I care about turnover because my recruitment costs are too high. And so when I'm thinking about a candidate, I could specifically think about what's the probability they'll still be here in 6 months, that they'll be here between 6 months and 18 months, that they'll be here beyond 18 months. So we could think about, like, is there a particular feature that we care about, or are we thinking broad scenarios? But figure out what those probabilities are. And then what you want to do is figure out what your preferences for those possibilities are, rather. So how much do you like or dislike those? In other words, what are the payoffs for each of those things, right? How much is each going to advance you towards your goals? How much is it going to cause you to retreat away? Now, in investing, that's very clear because we can measure that by money. But obviously, when we're thinking about things that are not as clear in terms of the payoffs as investing, like hiring decisions, then we need to start thinking about how much do we prefer those different outcomes over others. And that can sometimes get complicated, which is why we want to think it through. Do we value more team play, right? Or do we value just like, the cutthroat ability to sell, even if they're destructive to the rest of the team, right? So we have to sort of balance some of those things out and figure out what our preference is for those things out and what payoffs we really care about. Once you've done that, you have some general idea about what the upside outcomes are and what the downside outcomes are, but you haven't done your last step, which is to figure out what the probability of each of those things occurring is, which obviously really matters, right? Because particularly as we're thinking about risk management, right? There's 2 ways that a decision could be too risky for us. One is that you have a very high probability, too high a probability of bad outcomes, even though that none of the bad outcomes are devastating, right? It's just that when you compare that to the upside potential, it doesn't make sense. You wouldn't go for the upside potential because you're going to get a bad outcome too often. Right. So that's one way that things could be too risky. But the other way is that you could have a pretty low probability bad outcome, but it's going to cause you to die or lose all your money or something like that. And that's what we mean when we talk about risk tolerance, right? And it's that combination of those 2 things. How bad are the outcomes that you're willing to tolerate, and how frequently must those occur in order for you to be willing to tolerate those? But you can't just think about that on its own. You need to think about that in comparison to the upside potential. So we could think about that in a startup environment where mostly we're going to have bad outcomes, but those good outcomes, right, that are so good because maybe it's a unicorn, or which isn't just a money issue, right? You could really change the world. That going for that is a big enough payoff, even though it's rare, for you to be willing to take the risk of not winning. But we can't even ask those questions, right? Unless we make that stuff explicit. So that then allows you to compare the upside to the downside and figure out if the payoffs work for you. And then obviously it allows you to then go back and compare that to other options. Now, notice that in forcing yourself to do that and make that explicit, naturally, you're going to start asking yourself some questions. And this is what's really important. And this is why it's important to do this and not allow your gut to take over. Because if you just sort of gut it out and say, this one feels pretty good to me, you're not going to start to look for knowledge that's going to help with that problem of incomplete knowledge. But if I'm saying to you, Ashish, what do you think the probability of this outcome occurring is? And I force you to make that educated guess. I force you to make some sort of estimate, and you can give me a lower bound and an upper bound. That's okay. That makes you start to think, what is it that I know that can help me make this estimate? And what could I find out from other people? Who could I go talk to? What base rates could I go look up that would help me to actually be better in these estimates? And then also, because you've made it explicit, this is another reason why you're going to improve your knowledge, is that once you've made it explicit and you've kind of written it down, it creates an accountability to the process. Again, the gut doesn't, right? Because if you make a gut decision, however it works out, you can sort of say, yeah, my gut told me that. Right? Well, okay, that's not really true. But if I actually write it down, then I'm accountable to it. And that's really good. I'm not talking about accountable in a way that I can point fingers at you and say, look, you got this wrong, because that doesn't really make sense. It's more, let's use this as a way to help us calibrate, so that when we're thinking about the really important decisions that we make, should we invest, should we not invest, should we hire, should we not hire, that we can now create a really good feedback loop that helps us to actually become calibrated to the thing that we're trying to decide about, because those estimates that we're making, those educated guesses about what the possibilities are, how likely they are to occur, what the payoffs, what our preferences for those are going to get better along the way.
Right. Fantastic, Annie. Annie, you're used to being in very high pressure situations on the table,
Yes.
where you have to make decisions in a very short span of time. And often in life, we are faced with these kind of situations. So are there any mental shortcuts that we can develop to be able to make those decisions more efficiently?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that we can do to help with that. I think that the first and most important thing is that we need to understand that when we're thinking about the options that we have, that you don't want to think about those options in comparison to absolutes, like absolute certainty. In other words, if I'm thinking about three options and I'm thinking about option A, I don't want to compare it. I don't want to think about it as I need to be 100% certain that that option is going to work out, because first of all, that's impossible. But second of all, options are relative to each other, right? Like, and you can see how this is in poker, right? The quality of my hand is only going to be relative to the quality of your hand. So sometimes three of a kind is an amazing hand, and sometimes it's not. It completely depends on the quality of your hand. But also, as I'm considering my options when I play, should I raise, should I call, should I fold, any of those, I'm thinking about those options compared to each other. So it doesn't mean that when I choose to raise that I know for sure that that's the best choice. It's that given the knowledge that I have and the time that I have, because I have a time limit, that's the best choice relative to the others in my estimation. So that's the first thing, is we need to become relativists. We need to realize that we've got different choices that we can make. We're never going to be perfectly certain about any of them. So we want to think about how can we think about them compared to the other options that we're thinking about. And once we have one that's a clear winner, and which you might only be 60% sure of, it's just that you're much more sure that that's the best choice than the other two options that you have available to you. You can just do this quick final step, which is there a piece of information that I could find out that would actually change the relative ordering of these options that I have available to me, that would make me think that this one was not actually my best choice? Almost always the answer is going to be no. But if the answer happens to be yes, you can just say, do I have time to go find it? And if the answer to that is yes, go find it. If the answer to that is no, then go ahead and decide, and that's okay. Right. So that's the first thing, is don't be an absolutist, be a relativist. The second thing that can really help you get faster in your decisions is to recognize that you're deciding under uncertainty. And so don't get afraid of the outcome being bad and sort of recording that as a mistake. So this is part of the problem that we have that makes it hard for us to decide quickly, is when it doesn't work out well. Like if I order that dish in the restaurant and I don't like the food, I immediately think it's a mistake. But of course it's not, because of the result, you know, that would just be resulting. So try to keep that out of your head and make sure that you're keeping really good records of what your decision process was at the time, so that you're not as afraid of getting a bad outcome or a good one. That's another little trick. But then the main thing that we want to think about in terms of thinking about how do we decide fast is two really important concepts. One is, how reversible is the decision? So we know that when we're deciding under uncertainty, that that there's two things that can happen. One is that luck can intervene in a way that makes us want to change our decision. And the other thing that could happen is new information could reveal itself to you that would make you want to change your decision. So there are different ways that we can quit decisions that we made. So in poker, the quitting decision is obviously to fold. I can fold. Or I could be playing a certain line where I'm planning to raise on the next card, and then I quit that line and I decide to call instead because I found out new stuff. So when we're deciding under uncertainty, what that means is that the more uncertainty there is, the more likely you may want to change your mind later. At which point, when you're considering options, you want to think in advance about how quittable is it. So in investing, we would think about liquidity, for example, right? So the more liquid the investment, the faster that you can go in your investing decisions, because when things change in the world, you can sell and you can get to a different option, right? Another way to create what is sort of manufactured liquidity is if there's a way to hedge the investment really easily. So that's another way that you can decide much more quickly. If something happens where I realize I don't like this, even if it's not liquid, if I can get on a position that's going to be negatively correlated with that, then I'm okay because I neutralize it. And then another thing that you can do, because you know that you may want to change your mind later and it's not clear how things are going to turn out, is you can make lots and lots of investments. So that would be like portfolio theory, right? Is that if you spread your bets across a lot of investments, you don't need to be as sure about any single one investment, and that will allow you to go fast. So that's kind of the first thing to think about when we're thinking about uncertainty. The second thing to think about in terms of deciding fast is that a lot of times you have two options and they're really, really close to each other. And then you'll spend a lot of time deciding between the two. But that decision actually you should go quite fast on, because once you've got two options that are really close to each other, what that means is that they're so similar that given the limits of our own knowledge, you can't actually distinguish between the two. In other words, if we were to apply something like the 3 Ps to it, those trees, right, those possibilities and our preferences and the likelihood that those would occur and what the payoffs are would look nearly identical to us. So this is where we want to distinguish where we're spending our decision-making time. And we want to spend it on the sorting and not the picking, meaning we have options that we want to sort into options that are pretty good, right? So that we want to spend our time on and not spend a lot of time on our picking, where we're trying to decide between two options we already really like. And this is a place where people actually slow way, way, way down. So you can think about it like this, like, let's imagine that it's the before times and you have a choice between going on a vacation in Paris or a vacation in Rome. So you want to go on a vacation to a European city. You've decided that. You've done this sorting, right? You figured out, I want to go to a European city that has lots of history and good food. Okay, so you've already figured that out. Okay, that's beautiful to look at. And now Paris and Rome obviously are almost identical in that choice. But what happens is that you'll do that sorting. You'll decide what are the things that I'm looking for, right? What are the payoffs that I want? You figure out what sort of fits that. You get it down to these two choices. And then you spend the next 3 months asking everybody what they think. And you're on TripAdvisor and you're trying to figure, you're sort of talking to a travel agent and you're watching videos of Paris and Rome, and you can't decide between the two. But the whole point is that they're identical choices. That's kind of the whole point. So what that means is that we should really flip our coin, or by the way, use your gut. I don't care. At that point, you can use your gut to decide between the two. So when a decision is hard in that way, that they've both reached the threshold of something that would satisfy that what you would like to accomplish, then you should actually go quite fast. So you can find out that you're in that situation through using what's called the only option test. So if you have Paris and Rome, you can say, what if Paris were my only choice? Would I be ecstatic? I assume the answer is yes, if you're trying to go to a European city. If you thought, well, what if Rome were my only option? Would I be ecstatic? I assume the answer is yes. And once you've got options that both pass that test, then go ahead and decide fast. So that will also help you to decide really fast.
Great. Annie, just taking this whole decision framework to the current world, right? I mean, we're living in a world of instant gratification, right? Where, frankly, an unlucky, skillful decision maker may not get another chance.
Yeah.
Right? So how do you deal with this whole world of instant gratification where one mistake and you're out of the door while you may have done all the right things?
Oh, yeah. Gosh. Okay.
If I may add to that, Annie, because there are many questions on this topic.
Yeah.
Once you make a bad decision, how do you ensure that doesn't intervene with your future decision making? I mean, in poker, we have this term being on a tilt.
Yeah.
You could tie the two together.
Yeah. Okay. So let me think about this. Okay. So they're actually kind of related to each other. So basically what happens is that we're not very good at decisions in the moment. And you can always think about, there's always a fight. There's like a fist fight between you in the moment and you in the future. And in that fist fight, you in the moment always wins. Almost always wins. So let me explain what I mean. You commit that you want to eat healthier, right? And we've all made those commitments, right? I want to eat healthier. And then it's your kid's birthday and there's cake, and you eat it. And afterwards, we all have that feeling like that wasn't really worth it. Why did I eat the cake? I said that I was going to try to eat healthier. But that's that battle, right? There's this battle between you now and you in the future. And that battle occurs with tilt as well. So tilt is basically like something bad has happened to you and you've gotten emotional about it. And when you get emotional, you don't actually think very rationally because a part of your brain called the amygdala lights up. And the amygdala actually inhibits activity in your prefrontal cortex, which is really bad because your prefrontal cortex is where all your rational good thought lives. So when you get emotional, it actually short circuits your brain. So at least the good parts, the parts of your brain that are going to help you with rational thoughts. I don't want to say the good parts of your brain because there's lots of parts of your brain that like help you breathe and stuff. Those would probably be the most important parts of your brain. But so then what ends up happening when you're in that situation is that you start making really bad decisions that, like, if you could step back from it, you would know, like, I really shouldn't be making these decisions because it's not actually going to help me achieve my long-term goals. But here I am in the moment, making terrible decisions again. So the question really becomes, how do you win that battle between you now and you in the future? And how do you make it so that the future version of you, the one who's trying to achieve their goals, wins more often? That's really what you're trying to do, is say, in that battle between me now and me in the future, I really want future me to be able to win that battle more often. So there's a couple of things that you can do. One is to engage in negative thinking. Now, by negative thinking, I don't mean thinking that you're going to fail or setting negative goals or low goals for yourself. You should be reaching for the stars, and you should absolutely believe that you can absolutely achieve your wildest dreams. No question. But negative thinking is not thinking that it's guaranteed that you're going to get there, and engaging in what's called mental contrasting, which is thinking about the ways that you might actually fail along that route. And you can do this really well through doing what's called a premortem, which is, imagine that you have a goal. I want to eat healthier over the next 6 months. And then imagine it's 6 months from now and you failed and you didn't actually reach your goal. Well, now you can identify all the ways that you might fail. So if you're thinking about the healthy eating, you can identify, like, I'm going to go to a lot of birthday parties and some weddings, and, there's going to be really bad food around. And then at work, there's going to be stuff, at work that's going to be really unhealthy. And maybe I'm going to be really tired because I work really long hours. And then I'm just going to want to get some takeout on the way home. And I'm not going to make healthy choices because I'm going to be tired. And you can kind of figure out what all of those things are. In poker, I can identify that after I've lost a certain amount of money, that I'm probably going to make really bad decisions because I'm going to be on tilt. And that's going to actually make me make bad choices. So I can identify that might be a failure point. If I'm investing in stocks, if I have a portfolio, I can imagine that one of the ways that I'm really going to fail to achieve my goals in investing is that I'm going to overreact to downturns in the market. Because I know that, right? I know that that's a weakness that I'm going to have, because you know why I know that? Because everybody has it, right? So the market goes down 5%, and all of a sudden you become an active investor or something, and you're trying to sell the dip. I don't even know how you would do that, but whatever, people decide that they're going to try to sell that. And we know that that's a lot of the way that people underperform, right? If you index the market, people would make about 4%, and they don't. So why is that? Well, it's because of these tilt problems, and they don't actually foresee the way that they might fail. Okay, so once you've done all of that and you've realized, here are all the ways that I might fail, now here's the great thing, is you can do something about them. So now you can start to set some commitments in advance, and there's different levels of commitment. So I can commit to certain actions, right? So I could say, I'm going to commit that when I face cake, I won't eat it. Or I'm not going to put myself in situations that have cake. If I lose a certain amount of money at the poker table, I will commit that I will always get up. You can also do what's called category decisions. So a category decision in investing would be something like, I am someone who only looks at my portfolio for rebalancing twice a year. And other than that, I do nothing active in it. So you would identify yourself as a passive investor. So once I've taken that identity on, right, I've made a category decisions that I do not make active decisions. I am a passive investor who only does rebalancing. Okay, so I've set up who I am as a person, right? You could do this if you're a value investor or a growth investor or whatever. I'm a vegan. That's a category decision. So I don't want to eat meat and dairy. And so I can't, because I've made a category decision about myself. So that would be kind of the biggest escalation. Now, when you make these kinds of pre-commitments, I'm not going to eat cake. That would be a pre-commitment. I'm not going to be around cake. That would be a pre-commitment. Or you make category decisions. You won't be perfect at it, but you'll be a lot better at it. And notice that helps you with tilt for two reasons. One is that you've already sort of decided in advance. So the tilt can't affect you. That's number one. And I don't get upset when, like, I see cake, because I just don't eat that kind of food. And so I don't get into the same emotional state about it, because I've already kind of processed it in advance. You've thought about those emotions beforehand so that you become less surprised by the world. A lot of what causes tilt is this feeling of, I can't believe that happened to me. But when you've done mental contrast and you've thought about the ways that you might fail, it goes from, I can't believe that happened to me, to I knew this was going to happen and I already know what I'm going to do about it. Right. So that just kind of reduces tilt in and of itself. The other thing is that when those things happen, because you're trying to think about the future, when you think about the future, that engages the front part of your brain, which actually quiets the emotional parts of your brain down, which then gets you to tilt less. So this all kind of works together. And this will make you more successful, because the more that we can identify the obstacles that might stand in our way and think about what we can do about them, whether it's hedging or these kind of pre-commitments or category decisions, that's actually going to increase the chances that you actually achieve your wildest dreams.
Thanks a lot, Annie. And it's been a fascinating conversation so far. But in the interest of time, I just want to take some audience questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are a lot of viewers who've been asking questions. And I want to first sneak in a poker question, if you're okay, because there are many fans here, of your poker. So there's one of our clients who obviously, has watched all your games when he was in college, and he loved your heads up match with Phil Hellmuth. So So
Oh, yes.
so his question is, how do you prepare for your big games, especially before some of these, big opponents, including, I remember the match at Eric Seidel, which was amazing. And could you share a interesting personal poker story?
Sure. So, okay. So let me just start with the first question. How do I prepare for a big match? So the first thing is a lot of it has to do with just physical health. So poker is quite tiring. It's actually quite physically taxing, which I know it doesn't feel like that because you're sitting at a table, but I challenge you to sit down at a table and do high level calculus problems under uncertainty for like hours on end. You'd be really tired at the end of it. So I just, I always tried to stay in really good physical health. So that was kind of number one. And then number two was, really trying to think about the opponents that I'm going to be playing against. Now, obviously, if I'm playing in a tournament, it's a random draw in terms of who I'm going to be with initially. But then once you get past the first day, you actually do have a sense of who's going to be at your table, and you try to find some things out about them and sort of understand their tendencies. And in most of the big tournaments that you would have seen me play, I did that. So when I went into the Tournament of Champions, which is where I ended up playing with Phil Hellmuth, I knew a lot about those players. So I'm trying to think about, what is my model of those players? What do I think their weaknesses are? What are their strengths? Now, the match with Eric Seidel actually is really interesting, and it kind of gets into a personal storytelling, which is that Eric Seidel. So just so that people know, I was playing in the NBC Heads Up Championship. It's a bracketed event, so you start with 64 players who are playing one-on-one. That then narrows down to 32, which narrows down to 16, to 8, to 4, and then to the final. So I had played all the way to the final, and now I'm in the final match with Eric Seidel. We have to play 3 heads-up matches to decide who wins the tournament. So here's the thing that I want people to know. Eric Seidel is a much better poker player than I am. He's much, much better. So we played the first match, and there were certain things that I actually thought that he probably wouldn't expect of me to do. And so I thought at least when we played the first one, I thought there were ways that just because he had less knowledge of me than I had of him, that I might be able to gain a little bit of advantage. And I think that that's exactly what happened in the first match. Was I did some things that were creative and unexpected by him. So I actually won the first round like pretty easily because I was doing things that were unexpected. But Eric Seidel, like I said, is a much better player than me. So by the time we came to the second match, he actually sort of had a much better model of me as a player. He had learned a lot of stuff about me. And then I think that he had adjusted well. So I go into the second match, and all the tricks I was trying before no longer work. This is really horrible. So he beats me like a drum, and it doesn't go well in the second match. So now we're tied 1-1, and I have to go into the third match and think about how I'm going to play here. So this is where I think it gets really important to understand this stuff about like the 3 Ps, like what are my possibilities? What are the probabilities? I'm trying to find where's the highest probability of me winning depending on the strategy that I choose. And this is what I realized is that if I get into a decision-making contest with Eric Seidel, because it's a series of decisions that I'm going to lose. So you could think about it as, let's say that I think that I have a small disadvantage against him. Let's say I think that on any single decision that we make, he has an edge of 3% on me. If I make thousands of those decisions, he's going to win every single time, right? Because that 3% edge that he has is going to accrue over time, and I'm going to end up not being able to ever win. So I recognized that, and I said, well, that means that I want to shorten the number of decisions that I make. So you could imagine in the extreme, if we only made one decision where he had a 3% edge, now I can make luck go my way, and I actually would have a chance to win there. Okay. So taking those two extremes, if I played this for infinity, I would never win. And if I played this for one time, I would actually have quite a reasonable chance of winning. I decided that I wanted to make very few decisions. So essentially what I did was I played quite slowly so that the clock would run. So I sort of took the limit of my time. And that allowed the blinds to go up high. And then once the blinds were up high, I reduced my decision-making by choosing to mostly just go all in. Notice I don't have to make a lot of decisions in a hand if I choose that as a choice. So I could choose to play the hand of what's called a small line, where you make lots of little bets, or you can choose a big line, which is to put all your chips into the pot. So I did that. So I said, I want to make few decisions time-wise, and then also I want to play the hands in a way that actually reduces the number of decisions that I have to make. And so I did that, and I won. And I won because I recognized that the only way for me to win was actually to pull luck into the equation, to get more luck to be influential, because luck was going to be my best out here. And I think that that's probably the proudest that I've ever been of myself in poker, because me and everybody else has a tendency to want to think that you can outthink people. Like they want to think that you're better than other people at decision making, or that you can implement better strategy than they do. But this meta skill of sometimes just realizing, you know what, they're better than me, so let me try to figure out how to make the best of this situation. I think that that's actually a really important skill to have in life. And I managed to step back from that, and even having won the first match so soundly, still recognize that he was better than me, and whatever little thing that I could get out of that was gone. And to sit back and say, you know what, I'm not going to win this in a skill contest, so let me win this in a luck contest. And I really have never been prouder of myself in my whole life.
I think, Annie, this brings us to a very interesting question asked by someone as well, which is, if somebody in your team makes a decision and the outcome is bad, you have to pin it on someone. How do you deal? how do you?
Well, you don't have to pin it on someone.
How do you deal with that situation then?
Yeah. So obviously this depends a little bit about whether you're in leadership or not.
Yeah, if you're in leadership.
So if you're in leadership, actually, so this is actually a really important concept. So the way that we end up doing postmortems, so notice remember I was talking about a pre-mortem before, where you imagine failure. This is a postmortem where you've had the failure, and then you're trying to look back and figure out why. The way that you do that actually causes really bad behavior among the people on your team, because you misalign your incentives. So let me explain why. So this is generally what happens, right? Let's say that you're investing, you construct a portfolio, and you have some idea of what you think the value of that portfolio would be, or you make an investment in a particular vehicle, and you have some forecast of what you think the expected value of that vehicle is going to be, and you think that it's a winning vehicle. And then it ends up down 10%, right? So clearly we're all in a room and we're all having a meeting about it, right? And here's the deal, like a lot of people will be saying, I want to look at our investment process. I want to look at our decision process. But nonetheless, it's a very long meeting, and the people who made that decision are having to defend themselves. Now, imagine that you make the exact same decision and it's 10% to the good. Are you having a big, long meeting where the people who made that decision are having to defend themselves? Not in a million years. Now, here's the problem with behaving that way. Is that, first of all, when you only are looking at losses, all you're thinking about is over allocation problems. But on the other side, you may be under allocating. And that's as big a problem, by the way, because we want to get to just right? We neither want to over allocate nor under allocate. So that's problem number one, is that you're not exploring the possibility that you might have under allocated to a particular situation. Problem number two is that the same thing applies to both issues, right? It could be that your expected value was dead on and you got unlucky. Your expected value and the distribution was dead on and you got unlucky. It could be that the expected value was dead on, but you had the distribution wrong, right? In other words, it could be that there was like skew to the downside or skew to the upside, or it could be that there was more risk in there than you actually realized. It could be that your expected value was off. So you'd want to know that as well. It could be that the reasons that you won or lost were actually completely orthogonal, like unrelated to the reasons that you thought you would win or lose. So all of those things are true, whether you're 10% to the good or 10% to the bad, and you actually would prefer to explore both of those things. Okay, so number one is what should trigger your postmortems should be unexpectedness, not just did I win or did I lose. So if it's unexpectedly good or unexpectedly bad, so notice that things that are sitting in between, you shouldn't care very little about. But if it's unexpectedly good or unexpectedly bad, you should do a process done. But notice also what happens when we do postmortems in this way, where like the wins are celebrated and the losses are like whatever. We know from Daniel Kahneman and his work on prospect theory that the possibility that you get the champagne doesn't compensate equally for the possibility that you get in this horrible meeting where you've got to defend yourself. Okay. Because wins do not feel as good as losses feel bad. Okay. So people are going to try to avoid losing. And there's basically only two ways that they're going to be able to do that. Way number one is to play what's called a mini max strategy. So a mini max strategy is minimizing your maximum loss. But naturally, when you minimize your maximum loss, guess what else you minimize? Your maximum win. And you don't want people to do that. In other words, people are going to start taking these low risk choices. Anytime they have a choice between something that has a little more risk, but maybe a higher expected value, and something that has less risk and a lower expected value, they're always going to take the lower expected value to take on less risk. That's bad for you. You should like people to be exploring these higher expected value possibilities, and you're making them not do that through these mini max strategies, because then they can never lose too much and they're never going to be in the room. But the other problem, remember, is that they're being forced to justify their decision. And what's the best way to justify a decision? Everybody agreed. There was consensus. This is the way we've always done it. It's status quo. So what's going to happen then is that you're going to not just have people playing mini max strategies, but they're never going to innovate. They're never going to do something interesting. They're never going to explore some new strategy or some new tactic or a new investment vehicle or, whatever. And you want people to do that because the world changes and you want to be able to change along with the world. This is particularly important as startups become enterprises, because they don't want another startup to come in and disrupt them. Well, how does another startup come in and disrupt them that they're not allowing the people that in that what has now become an enterprise to innovate, because all those people are going to be stuck in a room having to defend the fact that they had an outcome that didn't come out well. Right. So that's why we want to do two things. One is we want to make process clear in the beginning. So that's why we want to do these 3 Ps. We want to think about what's the knowledge that's going in. We want to do pre-mortems in advance so that we can see that everybody has thought about the ways that it might go wrong and we're all okay with it. So that you have that record. And then the only time that you want to get in a room is when the world unfolds in a way that you did not expect it to. That's the only time you want to be in a room. Whether you won or lost, it doesn't matter. But that means that you have to do this work in advance, which means you can't decide with your gut because you have to make all these things explicit. You have to say, here, I'm telling you, this is how I think the world is going to unfold. Here's why I think we should do it. The upside compensates for the downside. I understand that we have this possibility of losing. Here's the ways that we're going to lose. Here would be the signals that would occur in the world that would tell us we were losing or winning. I'm giving you a view of the things that might go wrong. Here are the hedges that I'm putting on. Here you go. And then if you lose in the way that you expect, who cares? And if you win in the way you expect, that's fine. It's only when that unexpectedness happens. And that's going to get you aligned with your team. And it's going to allow people to feel free to make the best decision as opposed to the safest decision.
Thanks, Annie. One last question before we wind up. When you made one of your toughest decisions, if you feel comfortable, you can share it with us. What was the process and, the outcome? If you could elaborate on that.
Gosh. Okay. So let me think. So are you thinking like something personal, something poker, something business?
Whatever you're comfortable sharing.
I have a lot of tough decisions in my life. All right. So
maybe business would be good because you've spoken about your poker story.
Yeah. So there's a couple things. There's some sort of macro ones. I think that the decision to actually retire from poker was quite difficult because I had been known as a poker player. It was my brand. And what was funny was that I was doing about 80% of my time was spent on the business side of my life, actually doing the consulting. It's just that the world knew me as a poker player. And so when I was trying to decide, I probably actually retired too late. I probably retired about a year after I should have, because it took me a while to actually get to the best decision here. It's hard because you feel like you're giving up your identity. And that's kind of how I felt. It was very much part of my identity that I was a poker player. But I realized a few things. One is I didn't enjoy playing poker so much anymore because the game had really changed in a way that wasn't particularly good in particular for my style of play. But also when I started playing, it was a very tight knit group. I mean, it was a real, like, you were really close with the other players. And as things expanded and there was online poker and whatnot, it just sort of became a little bit more, a little bit more kind of algorithmic feeling, and the way that I would kind of put it is it probably felt similar to when people were trading options on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in 1982. That's really different than when people are sitting behind a terminal today. And I think that some people probably enjoyed both. I know some people who enjoyed both, but I know a lot of people who really love trading on the floor, who don't want to sit behind a terminal. And I think that I was probably more in that category. That was number one. Number two was the players got really, really good. And because I was spending so much time on my business life, I just didn't have the time to put in the work that I would need to do in order to keep up. That wasn't a problem for me, recognizing that. The problem was really, all right, let me think about this. If I leave, who am I? And I had to use my own process in order to do that. What are my goals? What do I want out of my life? What do I want for my children? I kind of wanted my children to live on the East Coast, and this would be an opportunity to move back to the East
So
Coast.
did you go through the pros and cons list?
Well, I did not do a pros and cons list because I don't think those are any good because they don't include any probabilities.
Yeah.
No, I went through the probabilities and I thought about sort of, what are the things that I really want to be doing? And I realized that there were three main things that I really want to be doing. I really wanted to dive even deeper into the consulting work, which I love. I do performance coaching. I work very deeply with teams. I embed. I don't come in and just do an hour with a company. I really embed with teams and I get really deep into their, issues and problems and culture. And that's what I love, that because that's very poker like, right? It's really getting deep into these problems. And I wanted to get even deeper into that and free up more time for that. I really wanted to write this book, Thinking in Bets, which then I followed on with How to Decide. But I really, really wanted to write that book. It was burning in me to do that. And I wasn't going to have time if I was also playing poker. So I wanted to sort of free up some time to be able to do that. And then also I wanted this foundation, the Alliance for Decision Education. So I realized that, time is a limited resource. And then I had to think about it as I thought about the next chapter of my life. What are the things that I was really, really passionate about? And, I kind of realized that poker was something that was really for me. That I could go deep on this problem of deciding under uncertainty, but I've been doing it for a long time. And I felt that I had kind of gotten as far as I was going to get, as far as that problem was concerned. And I realized that what I really felt like was going to be my passion, that had already started to develop as my passion and why I was transitioning out of it already, was this idea of marrying these two things and really being an uncertainty evangelist, that you are deciding on uncertainty and there are ways to deal with it and there are ways to get better at that. And that is where I wanted to spend my time. And that as I thought about where am I going to get the biggest bang? Like where am I most likely to find the passion and happiness that I want, that I needed to shave something away and that it made sense to do that so that I could let go of that piece that just had to do with who am I, and start to think about redefining that. So what was interesting was that once that happened, it was kind of funny because exactly what I expected would happen did, but I was already prepared for it, which was people said to me, why the sudden pivot? You were a poker player and then all of a sudden you were a consultant and a decision strategist and you were writing books and whatnot. And of course it wasn't sudden. I had been doing that for 10 years already, but that was what was holding me up, funnily enough, was that I knew that people would think, wait, you're not who you were before. But because I had already gone through this and thought through it, then I wasn't upset when people said, well, how come why did you just all of a sudden like change your mind? And I could say, no, and then I was prepared and I could say, actually, I was doing this for a long time, and it was a very thoughtful process. And so it was kind of brings the whole decision process together, as I was sort of thinking through that problem, but even so, it probably took me a year longer than it should have.
Right. Thank you very much, Annie, for sharing that. It puts a lot of things in context. And let me tell you, this has been an amazing conversation, a lot of insights, and we've gone on longer than what we normally do in these forums.
Well, that's my fault, because I tend to go on longer than
and even, in fact, people have stayed glued to their screens. We have,
there are very few webinars where you start with a number and end with a number higher than you start.
Right.
This is one of them. I distinctly remember we started with 340. We're at 400 now.
Oh, well, thank you.
Fantastic.
And at one point we had more than 700 people.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So it's really been an enjoyable experience. But before we wind up, I must tell everybody that both the books, whether it is Thinking in Bets and How to Decide, are a must buy, and they should be part of your library. What we have touched upon today is just the tip of the iceberg. And let me end by saying that this will be one of the best decisions you make.
Oh, thank you. Well, I hope so. I mean, it's uncertain because nobody's read the book yet. But so just remember that when you pick it up and you read it and you say, this isn't for me, that it wasn't a bad decision. Because you can't know, because you had to go with the information that you had. But yeah, no, this has been so much fun. I hope that everybody got something out of it. And I just love talking about this topic and thinking about how can we be so much more intentional about our decisions? How can we recognize that we don't have control over the way things turn out, at least not totally, and that we can get really comfortable with that and make great decisions even so. And you don't need to default to saying, well, there's lots of hidden information and luck, so I'm just going to go with my gut. That you can make great decisions under those circumstances, like completely wrapping in the hidden information and luck. And you can get way better at it. And this is what I will tell you, is that just like a poker hand, you will never know perfectly how to decide. But when you're really intentional about it, you will decide better than your opponents, than the other people who are deciding. And sometimes the person that you're deciding better than is who you were last week or last month. And if you can get constant improvement and just make better, like slightly better decisions, if you can handle the uncertainty better than you used to, if you can handle the uncertainty a little bit better than the people that you're competing against, those little advantages, just like Eric Seidel, are going to accrue, and you will have a much better life.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Annie.
Thank you very, very much. Have a great day ahead, Annie.
Yeah. And I wish to thank all the people who are watching us right now on the webinar as well as on YouTube live stream. We will ensure that this recording gets uploaded on YouTube so you can watch it later as well. Thank you very much, Annie, and I hope we can do something pretty soon again.
Oh, I hope so too. This was so fun. And I also would really like to thank the audience. I would like to say, the thing I want to say in terms of the audience is I appreciate everybody who's willing to engage with my content. When I'm writing and when I'm speaking is when I learn. That is I have to be able to clarify my thoughts. I have to figure out how to say it to other people so it can be understandable. It's where I find my own mistakes in my thinking, because sometimes I realize I'm being incoherent. And so my audiences are so important for my own learning process. And I would like to encourage anybody who's been listening. My website is www.annieduke.com. I have a contact form there. And people do, I really love when people have heard me speak or people who have read my work, write me, ask me questions, lob thoughts that they have or ideas that they have. I try really, really hard to respond to everybody who writes me. I am not perfect at it. I probably get to about 85 or 90% of the people who write to me, not because I'm not interested in what you have to say, but because it gets buried in my email and I am not a perfect human being. But I would really encourage people to go there. There's a